to trickle in. My name's Leanne Gidlow. I'm an associate professor of history in the department here at Wayne State. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this continuing series of Brown Bag Colloquia, sponsored by the Humanities Center. Our guest today is Professor Luke Nichter, who comes to us from Texas A&M University. He has a high level of expertise on the Nixon tapes, for reasons that will become very clear. I met Luke some years ago, actually, when he was a graduate student at Bowling Green State University as a very junior faculty member, and as a grad student, we were both in the basement, which suffered repeated floods of near biblical proportions. But at that time, Luke was hard at work on a dissertation on President Nixon and foreign policy in the late 60s and 1970s, oriented toward Europe. Not so much toward China, where a great deal of work has been and continues to be done, but actually oriented toward the Atlantic and toward Europe. Luke had a desk in a large office area where lots of grad students had desks, an area affectionately known as the bullpen, and was working there prodigiously on this dissertation project, and found that he needed access to the tapes that came from the Nixon White House. Between February of 1971 and July of 1973, President Richard Nixon secretly recorded nearly 4,000 hours of phone calls and meetings across the executive offices. These recordings played a leading role in the termination of his presidency with his resignation in August of 1974, and they remain a great treasure trove of historical information about the policy decisions and goings-on at this critical point in American history. That began a 10-year project for Luke of getting access to the tapes through litigation, ongoing litigation in the District Court of the District of Columbia, and then digitizing them and transcribing them. The collection that's now available at nixontapes.org is the largest collection of publicly available Nixon tapes. The 3,000 released hours are available there, and they take up 6 terabytes of data. Now, very enterprisingly, as he was doing this work, Luke sent copies of the work that he was doing, of places where people's voices appeared on the tape, sent copies to some of the people whose voices were heard, and got some very interesting reactions. Donald Rumsfeld put it this way. He said, "I remember well how surprised I was when I was told that he was taping meetings in the various locations where he spent time." Former President George H.W. Bush said, "I'm pleased that you found no record of his having made unpleasant comments about me." I'm sure he was. In any case, what started as a dissertation has resulted in certainly an important chunk of a professional career. I'd like to thank Dr. Edwards of the Humanities Center, Regina Peace of the Humanities Center for their work and support in helping to set this up. I'd like to thank Professor Mark Crewman for his support in making Luke's visit possible, Professor Newman for her help in publicity, and Andrew Nato and HDSA for their help in publicity as well, and Marilyn Vaughn for her administrative help in the history department. Professor Nichter is the author of 4 books, most recently, The Nixon Tapes, co-authored with historian Douglas Brinkley, released this past August on the 40th anniversary of the Nixon White House resignation. His forthcoming book is coming out by Cambridge next year, called Richard Nixon and Europe, The Reshaping of the Post-War World. That's the dissertation, reworked. So based on that dissertation that began in the damp and moldy basement of Williams Hall, Luke Nichter will be speaking today on Tales from the New Nixon Tapes, the gift that keeps on giving. You are welcome.
thanks everybody for a good turnout, and thanks everybody been given, but thanks to Leanne, the History Department, and the Humanities Center for putting this together, and obviously the marketing to ensure such a good turnout. And since we have an hour, I thought maybe I'll talk for and leave room to play a few audio clips that illustrate the points that I'm making. So maybe we'll talk for kind of 20 or 30 minutes and leave some time to intersperse that with a couple of examples from the website, and then leave time for your questions too. I always enjoy getting to those, and if no question is out of bounds and anything you'd like to know, I'm happy to attempt to answer. And if I don't know, I'll let you know that I don't know. Well, so I've been listening to Richard Nixon for about 10 years now. And I think when most people hear that, they must assume that if I didn't have some unmet psychological need then, that I certainly do by now. And I also joke too, we have a baby who's 5 months old, and she's probably heard the voice of Richard Nixon in the home more than any of her grandparents. But so before you call Child Protective Services on me, hear me out. There's a story worth hearing here, I think. So I started my doctoral studies, since we have so many grad students in the room. I started my doctoral studies about 10 years ago this fall. It was 10 years ago this fall. And you've heard enough description about Williams Hall, where the history department was located in the basement. So there were these dozens of graduate carrels, kind of most universities have in a department or in a library. And there were these biblical floods every once in a while. You had to stack your books up high, and the flood waters would come in, and you had to be careful when you're dealing with computers and this kinds of equipment and transcribing things. Fortunately, no one was electrocuted, but I think that wouldn't have been too far beyond what we experienced. So, but what turned out, though, is, and I say this not joking, but seriously, it was a perfect place to work. My students couldn't find me. No one wanted to go down in this place. Nobody else really wanted to work down there. I was sort of the strange guy sitting in the back, which I think the elevation was about 2 inches higher there than it was in the other side of it. So it was better for floods where I was at. And I got a lot of work done. And 10 years ago, when I started this, there were no finding aids to the Nixon tapes. I mean, they existed at the National Archives, but unless you asked for them, they weren't volunteered for you. And even if you got them, and you know this now, I didn't know this then, the basic index of the Nixon tapes is 30,000 pages. The various finding aids are each 3,000 page PDF files. Nixon's schedule, you have to kind of flip between these to kind of find exactly who's in the room at a given time and what they're talking about. His schedule maintained by the Secret Service is another several thousand pages. It's a massive thing. So for the first 6 months, as I'm listening to these recordings, I mean, the obvious voices are easy to understand. I mean, Nixon's, and Henry Kissinger has a very recognizable voice, although he mumbles a lot and kind of speaks into the notes and the papers that he has. And so you'll hear some of the examples today, the challenges in terms of the audio quality and hearing what people say. And after doing this for so many years, even today, there are just certain conversations that I can't figure out. And if I can't figure them out, I'm not sure you can. And as I was doing a lot of this work, listening and then digitizing and then making the website available and transcribing, I was doing a lot of the same work at the time the State Department Historian's Office was, preparing the various Fruce volumes they put out. And they had planned a much more ambitious goal with the tapes. They were going to be in 30-some volumes, and they were going to use the tapes feature them much more prominently in a number of the Nixon and Ford Fruce volumes. And that really never happened because they kind of gave up. They were too difficult. The declassification review took too long. The National Archives did not have an easy mechanism to make audio files. They declassified the content being discussed, but not the audio. It's kind of silly. So it became too difficult, and they ended up scrapping a lot of that work. So I was transcribing some things. I would call them for advice. They would call me, and there are certain things none of us could figure out. To my ears, when you have a cabinet room, especially, is some of the worst quality conversations. A cabinet room full of Southern congressmen. They all sound like Wilbur Mills of Arkansas, the chair then of Ways and Means. And we just can't. And you have unidentified speaker 1 and 2, and it just gets silly after a while. So there's certain ones you have to give up on. There are returns to scale in terms of how much time you can spend on these tapes sometimes. And really, at the beginning of this work, I was the person least likely to do this. I didn't plan on this. It was really completely accidental. The advice that I was given by my advisor at the time, which I still think is good advice, and I give it to my own students now, is you have to specialize in something. You have to make your mark on something. You have to do original research in something. It doesn't matter whether you're in history or the hard sciences or social sciences. And the advice I was given in particular was do something kind of along the archival frontier. If most formally classified records become available kind of 20, 30, 40 years later, choose something that's new to historians. And it was probably the best advice that I got, because rewinding the clock put me kind of in that Nixon to Ford period, about 10 years ago, when records were just starting to come out. And 10 years later, now moving forward in time, the Carter records are starting to come out, the Reagan records, so the pattern still holds more or less. But still, sometimes it takes even longer than that for records to become available. And even today, 40 years after the end of Nixon's taping system, there's still 700 or 800 hours, 700 to 800 hours, more tapes than Johnson taped or Kennedy taped, or those before them taped, that still haven't been released. So there's still an enormous amount, and this work will be ongoing for about as long as I can stand it, or my wife, or our baby can stand hearing about Richard Nixon in the house. And so that's really how I fell upon it. I tried to help the Miller Center. The Miller Center had done a lot, the Kennedy tapes and the Johnson tapes, and they really kind of stopped working on Nixon after about 2005 or 6, in the same time period that I was starting to investigate the topic myself. And they really had no plans to publish anything else in Nixon, so the door was wide open for someone to do it. And as I always say, I was really the least likely person to do this. You really needed two skill sets, really different skill sets to do this. You had to know the history reasonably well from the time period, so that when you listen to a tape, you kind of know who's talking, know who they are, know what they're talking about vaguely enough to find your way around the tapes. And if you need to know more, now you can use Wikipedia to find the basics of what they're talking about. And there were certainly a lot of people who knew the history better than me. I was a grad student, I was coming up, I was learning as quickly as I could, getting up to speed, but there were plenty of other more distinguished scholars who knew the history better than I did from the time period. And then the other skill set, very different, was the technological know-how. And historians aren't trained to edit audio and enhance audio and clip audio and manipulate audio in all these different ways. I had a little bit of experience from undergrad, kind of briefly being a computer science major. So I kind of had this rudimentary, kind of 10 years at least out-of-date experience. But I was kind of the right person who could do each passably well and kind of had the time and the interest to do it. So I just kind of fell into this on accident. So finding, and I get lots of things I know now that I didn't know then, but I really had no interest in Nixon. I thought, what new is there to learn after all? And so much has been written about Nixon and Watergate, Nixon and various abuses of power, or Nixon or the Vietnam War, or China, or the Soviet Union. I didn't feel like there was a lot left to learn. And as a grad student, that's the last kind of dead end you want to head down, because as you know in history, and you're working on a thesis or a dissertation, that often shapes your job search when you finish grad school. It shapes wherever you go and what you teach. It shapes what your first book and your promotion and tenure process. And the last thing you want to do at the beginning is head down a path that doesn't look very certain. And the more that I listened to the tapes in those first 6 months of listening, I didn't know what was being discussed. I kind of vaguely knew what was going on, again, not having finding aids. And I realized for the most part that what I was listening, I hadn't seen in a book anymore. I hadn't heard of these transcripts. I haven't heard of mention of these conversations outside of some Watergate snippets that have appeared in documentaries and films over the year, and an occasional book. I knew Stanley Cutler's work, and I knew a few others who had written prominently, including a prominent scholar in the room who had written a big book on the Nixon administration. But not a lot had featured the Nixon tapes. And so I realized that I added it up and found that only about 5 to 7% of the tapes had ever been transcribed or published in any way. About 5 to 7%. Now it's an awfully important 5 to 7%. It documents Nixon's role in the cover-up in Watergate, the starring role that the tapes played as really the smoking gun, kind of evidence that drove Nixon from office after the Supreme Court ruled in the summer of 1974 that Congress could subpoena the tapes, that there were limits to Nixon's use and assertion of executive privilege over these private recordings, which had been private for his successors. But the law had changed. They were not private in his own case. And the law ultimately had to change, and I'll get to that a little bit later. So I found there was a whole lot to do on the Nixon years. And the more I listened, the more I realized there was nothing done on so many subjects. In part, that's because when because the tapes and the records were released the way they were, kind of front-loading on Watergate and abuses of power, in a way it kind of, it created a kind of diaspora of Nixon scholarship. And even a lot of the prominent records of those who served in the Nixon White House, they're everywhere. I mean, anyone who does a dissertation on Nixon is going to log some airline miles, because it's not like you can go to the Nixon Library in Yorba Linda, California, and everything's there neatly for you. A bunch are at the Ford Library here, a bunch are at the Library of Congress, a bunch are at the Hoover Institution at Stanford. Because the Nixon presidency ended the way it did, really unique in a sense. It wasn't like Kennedy to Johnson, and Nixon to Ford was different. People gave their papers wherever they felt like it, and wherever they felt most loyal. The Nixon Library opened as a private institution, and a lot of aides didn't trust it being there. Well, how would my papers be handled? Would they be abused somehow for political purposes? A few stayed on with the Ford administration and felt their papers rested there. But it's created an unusual number and type of hurdles for scholarship in the Nixon years that don't exist for other presidencies. And so it's delayed this conversation that we're trying to have about the policies of the Nixon years until much later in the case of the Nixon presidency. I think we're still very much 40 years later at the beginning of many theses and dissertations being written in books on so many subjects having to do with the Nixon years. And so I'm down in the Carols, avoiding floodwaters and working by myself, and really all on my own, but not for long. And this, Lee had alluded to this, the contact with some of the Nixon aides. Some of them I contacted myself, and I have a list of those, and some of them I don't put up here because they're still alive and they're personal. But what fascinated me, again, I'm a grad student. I'm working on what I thought was a means to an end. I'm writing a dissertation, doing research for that. I need to graduate, hopefully on time. Hopefully after that is a job for me someplace. And hopefully after that is a promising start of an academic career. And I walk upstairs to the department to check my mail or something, and our department secretary hands me a note and says, Henry Kissinger's office just called for you. I didn't contact him. The website wasn't launched yet. I have no idea to this day, how word gets around about these things. But he was the first one who contacted me. And I kind of folded the note up and didn't pay much attention to it. I thought, yeah, right. I thought it's probably my roommate calling me, or wanting to make me feel as important as I probably thought I was, working on some of these recordings. So I put it away, didn't pay a lot of attention. And I went back to, I think, later that day or the next day, and I noticed the name that was given had been thanked in the last few of his books as an assistant or someone who had helped him with the production of the book. And it was a 201 number, which I kind of knew was New Jersey outside of New York, and I knew he was based out of New York. So I called the number, and right away his assistant said that Dr. Kissinger would like to meet with you as soon as possible. Didn't say what, didn't offer to pay my travel, which would have been really nice. And didn't say why or what. I assumed it was Nixon tapes, because Kissinger had written this 3,500-page memoir. Who writes a 3,500-page memoir? Presidents don't do that. And in his, I think it's the second volume, Kissinger really only briefly addresses the tapes. He's downplayed them, he's ignored them for most of his life, at least publicly. And in the second volume, he says something like, how can these recordings be a valid historical source? Because how can one person know the recordings exist and maybe no one else in the room does? Because most, even of Nixon's inner circle, didn't know they were being recorded. A few did. Bob Haldeman did, and those who worked for him did. Larry Higbee, probably Gordon Strong, maybe Dwight Chapin, maybe their secretaries, and then the Secret Service, who installed it and changed the tape reels every day, in the mornings and the afternoons. But apart from that, Henry Kissinger didn't know, John Dean didn't know, Chuck Colson didn't know, John Ehrlichman didn't know, George Bush didn't know. A whole list of names. George Shultz didn't know, Donald Rumsfeld didn't know. And all these guys got their, because they happen, all these guys, all got their start in government during the Nixon years. And it's really kind of uncanny, how many of them have been with us for so long. In the case of Paul Volcker, up until the current administration, 40 years later. And so I immediately confirmed, said, sure, I'll come up and meet, even though I wasn't sure what I was meeting for. And I think the euphoria of that conversation wore off a couple of days later, and I realized I had to cancel on it. I had a conflict. I thought, this is never going to happen again. I'm done. This was my one chance. And I looked at the calendar, and I realized that I had a wedding to attend And then I realized it was my wedding. we were married on April, and believe it or not, as forgetful as I was, the wedding did actually come off, and we're still married to this day. But we were married April 5th, and he wanted to meet, I think, at the beginning of April or very late March. And I knew that Jennifer would kill me if I went up there and tried some unknown mission for an unknown specified period of time. So I called back, and he was very gracious, and we rescheduled. But I didn't even know anybody who had met Kissinger, not on that level. And I knew James Rosen had just published his book on John Mitchell, the Attorney General in the Nixon years. And I knew he had either interviewed him, because he did a lot of interviews, or tried to interview him or something. So I called him and I said, what should I expect? I mean, what's going to happen here? And I got a feeling he was a little bit jealous, because he said, if you can get a meeting with Henry Kissinger in less than 5 years, you're doing better than the industry average for those who try to talk. He just doesn't give interviews very often, especially to academics, and especially to those who are actively writing something, putting it on the web. This was a little bit early for blogs still, but especially not in those circumstances. So I went up there, and I walk in his office, and it's a couple blocks north of Grand Central. In this building, and you walk in, it's very secure, and there's a directory of all the floors, all the companies that are in this building. It's about 24, 25 stories tall. The floor that he's on, I think it was the 24th floor, doesn't exist on the building directory. It just doesn't, it's just not there. And you check in, and they kind of screen you, and they take you to a special elevator to go up. And it was I admit, it was very impressive for a graduate student. You go up there, and you have the heavy glass, everything's Chinese motif, screens, and furniture. Of course, that's what he wants to be known for. He definitely, his books. I don't think he's ever published a book which he doesn't have at least one photo of him shaking hands with Chairman Mao. I mean, this is what he wants to be associated with. And so I was called in and to this conference room. And a couple years ago, Stephen Colbert did a skit. You may have seen where he jumped out of the closet and kind of danced around Kissinger's office. And Kissinger grabs the phone and says, "Get me security." And it was a really funny skit, kind of on the Colbert style. I thought that's exactly how the office looked when I went in. So I went in, and he was sitting in the corner, kind of slumped over, and much like I did, or probably many of us did, turned my phone off as soon as I walked in. And he said, "No recording devices." And I guess that's an appropriate concern if you're meeting the person who works on the Nixon tapes, and he already feels grievously wounded from being recorded in the White House. So I put it away, and I say, "No, I'm just putting it away so we're not going to be disturbed." And I sit down, and he directs me to this couch next to him, which I found out 1 week later was the exact same seat that Sarah Palin sat in, because she was touring around. She was not yet on the McCain ticket, but she was talked about as a possibility, and she was meeting with kind of foreign policy gurus to enhance her image in foreign policy. So he directs me to this seat, and he says, "Why are you here?" And I'm thinking, you called the meeting. I mean, what are you supposed to say in that moment? And so I said, "Well, I'm working on the Nixon tapes. There wasn't a website yet for me to show them." And I said, "I think there's a lot we had to learn, and I'm surprised by how many of them haven't been published or been transcribed before." And he looks at me and he says, he disagrees. He says, "No, if you want to understand the policies of the Nixon administration, you have to study the memoranda between the president and myself." That's what he said. This is sort of every word he says are things I'll never forget this meeting. And so I respectfully disagreed, and I said, well, what the tapes show us is a process, a decision-making process. All options considered, how you arrived at one option or another, why you excluded other options, how you decided, how you reflected after the fact, either then or sometimes long after, a year or two later. And I said, so no, I think a memorandum, can maybe be written by someone who wasn't even present in the particular meeting. It's gone through many drafts. Certainly it's cleaned up for lots of reasons. And so the tapes, it's really, LBJ said, with the bark off, the tapes. And he said, "Give me an example." And so I had a colleague with me, and we had a couple of short clips ready just in case we had a chance to show that we were the tapes experts. And I had them pared down nice and short. We had a 20-minute meeting. How much time can you spend on listening to clips? I don't even know how well he hears. Now he's 93, so then he was in his late 80s. And so we played it, as we were getting a clip ready, I said to him, this was a fairly new discovery then, that he had also, the Kissinger telcons, some of you might have used them. that Kissinger also recorded many of his own phone calls in his own office in the White House. It wasn't like the Nixon system. These were typically aides or secretaries listening in on the phone and making something as close to a sort of rudimentary transcript as they could, comparing notes. And sometimes they're very good, sometimes it's very, lots of gaps. And so I said, but when you, Dr. Kissinger, went to the Oval Office, as he did numerous times almost every day that he and Nixon were both in Washington, Nixon would also kind of sometimes use Kissinger as a ruse to get someone on the phone. He'd come in the Oval Office and he'd say, why don't you pick up the phone and call maybe Soviet Ambassador Dobrynin, and you tell him X, Y, and Z, whatever it is. I said, so in that case, Dr. Kissinger, Nixon may have a recording of that, which means I have a recording of it, but you don't. And so he was very interested in that. And so we played a few examples for him, so we could hear these. And I'll play a couple for you in just a minute. And at a certain point, in a 20-minute meeting, and Kissinger, of course, when he was Secretary of State, had this, he really worked on this image of kind of negotiating the tough guy by day and the womanizer by night in many cases. He's meeting with our enemies, the Russians, the Chinese, the North Vietnamese during the day, and at night, almost every different night, he has some attractive actress on his arm or nearby him or at some Georgetown party or in Hollywood or something like that. And it was funny because he had one note taker in the room who was a young, attractive British woman, and almost all of the aides were either very old or very young in his office. And at one point, she takes the steno pad that she was taking notes on and turns it over and sets it down. And I knew things were going well because he was enjoying himself listening to these clips. So let's have a listen to one of these. And the first one I want to talk about, and of course there's lots, in the book there are a lot of serious policy conversations, Vietnam, China, Moscow, and lots of other foreign policy issues. The book's probably 75% foreign policy because I think that's a fair distribution of how Nixon himself spent his time in the Oval Office during the 2 years this book covers. We're working on a second volume now that'll be more 72 and 73. We'll cover more Watergate, domestic policy, economic policy, and some other things. But besides serious policy, there are a lot of funny moments. And these guys had fun sometimes. So let me play one of the more fun ones, if I can find it. So what I've done here is, this is a PDF page out of the book. So I think you'll be able to follow along a little bit. And I'll turn the audio on here with the speakers, and if I have to adjust it as we go along, I will. But I think you'll be able to follow along with the transcript.
Where the hell do you think Kissinger was over the weekend when I was trying to call him?
Probably out in some base.
I hope so.
Probably was.
It wasn't through, I think one thing is correct, it wasn't through lack of office.
Oh, my word.
They No, Dan, it's got nothing to do with modesty. The head of their state security, General Antonov, greeted me at the airport and said he had a whole bunch of girls, all 25 years and younger.
You might remember that's how they got to Alpha.
Yes,
Not the
the rudeness of these guys is not particularly high. Then I said I want to take a swim, and that's also under the state security. So again, then they do I want masseuses, nurse, masseuses. They said, old ladies, old sniper. But they did it, Jesus Christ. It's all fun out of it. It was just so beautiful, and they brought it up on every occasion. General Antonov was riding a shotgun in the car all the time, and he's had to do security too, we got past the Moscow studios, and I said, I know a lot of actresses in Hollywood. He said, try my girls, they got a lot more experience.
So obviously the tapes are kind of a treasure trove for both the serious and the not so serious. And they provide, again, how does this compare to a memo? I mean, this kind of thing would never show up on a memo. The whole point of a polished memorandum is that this kind of thing never sees the light of day. I mean, this was Nixon's private taping system. Johnson's tapes had been private, Kennedy's had been private. He never expected these to be public. So what was different about Nixon's was that he recorded everything. It was sound activated. It wasn't like Kennedy's and Johnson's where he could turn it on or turn it off with a switch if it suited him politically or otherwise. Nixon's recorded everything. It was a state-of-the-art system at the time. And so there's no one that these tapes are more damaging for than Richard Nixon, because it got everything. Nixon expected he would leave the presidency in January of 1977. He would return to San Clemente, California, his Western White House, and he could do what he wanted with them. The law was different then. Today, when President Obama sends a text message, we like to think that the National Archives is supposed to one day preserve that and make that available to researchers. Thank God I'm not starting my career researching 20 years from now text messages and instant messages and Facebook messages. But that's the expectation now. The law is totally different. How we define personal, how we define political is different, and it's different because of these Nixon tapes. So there are some other examples here too, and I'll see if I have some more time here toward the end. But because of examples like this, as well as lots of obviously more serious conversations that the book is full of, in some ways the tapes explain better than anything else. One of the scenarios I give to my students is, imagine you're solving a crime and you have various pieces of evidence available to you. You have a police report, you have eyewitness testimony, you have circumstantial evidence or kind of other information about the scene of the crime after the fact, forensics, DNA, and so forth. What's better than having an actual recording, of the assailant sort of planning the crime, how they're going to do it, execute it, how they reflected on the crime after the fact. But the tapes also distort in some ways. As much as the tapes help us, I think those who work on presidential recordings, there's an extra burden on them to kind of apply an appropriate filter when you use the Nixon tapes. To give you a couple of examples, the tapes in many ways create microhistory, as a term. It's recorded everything in the Nixon years. What was recorded, there's no direct correlation between what was recorded, the number of minutes and hours, and its historical significance in some cases. You can have hours of personnel decisions and hours of just sort of minutia of the Oval Office, and maybe one really important 20-minute conversation on another subject. So it's hard. When I started this before the tapes, the old way was to go to the presidential libraries, and you've got the memorandum of conversation, you might have a diary, you might have policy reports, and after a while you start to see, well, where is the most amount of paper? Maybe that's where I should spend most of my time. With the tapes, that's not just because something was recorded more than something else doesn't mean it's more worthy of your attention. Research is different when you use presidential recordings. Another thing I learned over the tapes is working a long time with the tapes. A couple more quick examples is in some ways the tapes show us that I think Nixon and Kissinger might have gotten too much credit for the opening to China. I think broadly speaking, the right and the left have given him. He kind of owns that subject for better. For better or for worse. It's a complicated relationship then. It certainly is today. 40 years later, I think it's really still too soon to tell whether that was a really, really good thing or not quite as good. And what the tapes show, because the problem of over the years before this book is that there's a soundbite here, there's a clip here, a phrase here, and if you don't have the context, if you don't listen to a sufficient sample size of tapes, the perspective is very different. And so in particular, when you listen to enough of the conversations dealing with Nixon and China, this is one of the subjects studied the most of the Nixon years, what you see in the Oval Office is even Nixon and Kissinger are surprised at how quickly relations are improving with the Chinese. And they're sitting there thinking, we're in the Oval Office, we're the ones supposed to control the levers of foreign policy. And I think we've given it a little too much credit because it's giving Nixon and Kissinger all the credit for the opening in China. First of all, it wasn't a new idea. It started in the 1960s. And to give even Americans all of the credit sort of takes away agency from the Chinese, who clearly were also acting in their own interests at the time. And there's a couple of funny conversations. Nixon and Kissinger were so surprised by how quickly things were moving, they really wanted to slow things down. They didn't want things to become too friendly with China. And in particular, when our ping pong team was in Tokyo, the ping pong diplomacy at the beginning of that, and then they were invited to Beijing and got an audience with Premier Zhou Enlai. The New York Times covered it very prominently because the Chinese wanted the New York Times to cover this at the time. And Kissinger comes into the Oval Office, giving Nixon a summary of what's in the New York Times that morning, and says that Zhou Enlai had just said to the ping pong team that your visit to my country begins a whole new era in relations between your country and mine. Nixon saying, are you kidding me? He said that to a ping pong team, and it caused problems for Nixon's policy. But you don't realize that unless you listen to enough tapes. It caused problems with our allies, with Japan, with South Korea, with Vietnam. We thought we were moving a little too quickly. Problems with Taiwan, definitely. Problems with our European allies. It caused problems in the UN and ultimately resulted in Taiwan being expelled from the UN General Assembly in the fall of '71, certainly much earlier than Nixon was prepared to live with. But as soon as the cat was out of the bag, meaning Nixon announced his visit, that he was going to go to China on July 15, '71, the whole thing kind of unraveled. And any ability, I mean, it was sort of just a shock to our allies, and there really wasn't anything that could be done on the damage control at that point. So when you listen to a sufficient sample size, the context for some of these conversations is very different. You can't use the tapes in isolation. They have to be used with the traditional textual materials and others. At the same time, I would argue, you also can't ignore the tapes. I think any book that's written now, that I see come out, written covering a period between February '71 and July of '73, and I know these were recorded, any book to me that comes out and ignores the tapes at the same time, to me is a flawed book, because and this continues to happen. And those who work on presidential recordings, whether it's the Miller Center at UVA or me or a series of others, we sometimes wonder, why don't more scholars use the tapes in their research? It seems to be mostly a younger generation, a sort of iPad generation that's more willing to spend the time to listen to the audio, more willing to manipulate the audio as they need to improve the quality and hear them better and transcribe them. But still then, it's terribly time consuming. There is no substitute to just spending a lot of time with this material to understanding. There's only so many shortcuts you can take with the tapes, and cutting out time is not really one of them. Technology can only do so much. So that's really the purpose of this book. To make it easier for scholars, we did a first draft of this book, and it was even bigger than it was. It was a monumental achievement for us, we thought, because no academic publisher has done this before. There are academic publishers who publish Kennedy tape-related books and Johnson tapes, but no academic publisher or university press had ever done anything like this. And so for us to get a commercial publisher to do this, and to get a big audience for the book, and our contract was only 500 pages, so to get 800 pages is sort of unheard of with a commercial book, and to not see any increase at all in price. The first version had a lot more annotation by us, had a lot more description and background, because this is hard for a reader who doesn't have kind of specialized knowledge. It's hard to read transcripts of people speaking kind of in real time. But I think at a certain point when we had to make cuts, I had a conversation with Doug about this, and I thought, at least this is my view, that what's more important, kind of my description of what they're talking about, or just hearing the tapes for yourself? I mean, at what point, in a way, should the tour guide become more important than the destination? And at least in my view, not very often. I mean, there are cases where that can be made. But we cut it down and really left it kind of in raw form. And no book had ever done this kind of format before. Now you look at other books, like Stanley Cutler's is the model to follow when you're looking at this. The books like that are, and this is no knock on him, but books like that are full of ellipses. And the problem when you have an ellipses is you don't know whether you're missing one word or whether you're missing 5 pages. It doesn't empower the reader in the same way. So we've tried to keep portions of the conversations completely intact. There are a few unclears, but there are fewer unclears here than there are in any other book about the tapes. So we really have always seen this as kind of a public service. Even with when I started this, if 5 to 7% of the tapes had been transcribed and published, this book might take it to 10 to 12%. It shows you how much left there still is. And for what's not in the book, well, there'll be a second volume, then it's on the website for free. So anything the publisher said, the publisher came to us constantly and said, you've got 50 conversations on the details of the Soviet summit in 1972. How many can we really keep? In most cases, the answer was 1 or 2. So the rest are going to go on the website. And that's really been my goal from the very beginning. Even if it wouldn't have gotten published, they would have all been on the website eventually. So I think to wrap this up a little bit, that's really our goal is, 40 years later, I've seen all that's been published on the Kennedy tapes and the Johnson tapes, and I feel like 40 years later, it's time to start a similar discussion about the Nixon tapes. I would argue they were far more important historically for ending for both Nixon's presidency, the presidency in general, and laws related to research. the tapes, because of Nixon's presidency, the way it ended the way that it did. And Nixon left in August of '74 to go to San Clemente, thought he was going to revert back to his original plan, take his records with him. He even made an agreement with the head of the GSA to build a vault on San Clemente, have his tapes transferred. Then he was pardoned 30 days later. And Congress felt that once you pardoned him, we would never have justice. There would never be a trial. We would never really learn the whole truth. And Congress essentially subpoenaed and seized all of Nixon's tapes and papers because they felt that was the proper way to get to the truth. We can't let this guy get away for free and retreat to California in shame with all of his records. That they ruled in effect, and the Supreme Court backed it up, that these tapes in essence belonged not to Richard Nixon, but to us, but to all of us, effectively. Transfer them to the National Archives, made them available to researchers some years later, and as a result, all of presidential research has changed. First law was PRIMPA, then there was the Presidential Records Act in the late 1970s, and if you go to a presidential library today, there's really two sets of rules. Those libraries that are before the Presidential Records Act and those that have since. And if you're earlier, it's an MDR. If it's later, it's a FOIA request. And just the way records are processed, made available, there's similarities, but there are really a lot of differences. And one of the things that's shocked me about this work is I feel that there's almost something missing. It's going to be, as hard as this was for me, it's going to be a lot harder for future generations of scholars. Because I feel now, doing this, that I almost need a mini legal education in order to get through some of these restrictions. Because the traditional way of doing things was you go to an archive, you request the materials, they're served to you, and you don't really question that relationship between the researcher and the archivist. Now you have to. And you have to because of Nixon tapes on all subjects, because the law changed. And now to get something released or reviewed, you have to know the proper legal vehicle to do so. And it's really changed, the tapes have changed the way research has been done on the presidency forever.